just trigger warning I need to do with my work. But I'm now going to talk about the Nazi program of child euthanasia, and that's their term, which is really a misnomer. These children were neither terminally ill nor suffering. They were just deemed to have mental or physical defects. And this was the Reich's first program of mass extermination. It predated the murder of Jews and Sinti and Roma and Slavs and other groups. And it was designed to become a permanent part of the healthcare system. Unlike these other forms of mass extermination that were more wartime operations, this was a deliberative scientific process. And the idea was to rid the state of children who would be a drain economically and a danger to its gene pool. So at least 5,000 children perished, which is a very small number compared to the indiscriminate killing of other groups. But in my mind, this is even, the smallness of the number is what makes it so scary, because it's so deliberative. Doctors were going through these case files in, excessive detail and passing them on, and it was a scientific process. You were judging children as individually worthless or worthy. There were around 37 children's wards dotted inside the Reich. This is not out somewhere in Poland or Eastern Europe. This is inside communities. And this is Spiegelgrund in Vienna, which is right outside. You can take tram number 47 and still get there. And it's one of the deadliest, where almost 800 children were killed. So in contrast to our mechanized images of the Holocaust, I think euthanasia has been overlooked, and it's important to understand its dimensions. It involved intimate killing by the doctors and nurses that saw these children every day. They knew their names, they fed them, they changed their sheets. And women. This is the only program of extermination that really relied on women. Killings were done in the youth's own beds as staff would issue overdoses of barbiturates until the children grew ill and died, usually of pneumonia. And a ton of people knew this was going on. There were protests outside of Spiegelgrund. There were rumors published that were being denied in the newspapers. But people had different opinions. Some parents would actually deliver their children to the killing center and request that their child be put to death. The doctors were sort of offended at this because this was supposed to be a scientific process, and it was supposed to be the doctors that decided. And so they would not honor parental wishes to put a child to death. But yeah, there you go. Okay, so where is Asperger in this program? Well, you've seen me flash up Hamburger, who was a zealous supporter of the program. He transferred numerous children to Spiegelgrund as head of the children's hospital. This is Max Gündel, who's the city councilor on the board of Spiegelgrund. He's the municipal director of Spiegelgrund. This is Erwin Jekelius, who's the head doctor of Spiegelgrund. And so Asperger co-founded the Vienna Society for Curative Education with these three guys. He worked very closely with them. So close was Jekelius to the regime. I don't know if you can recognize this woman, if she resembles Adolf. That's his sister. Paula Hitler. Yeah. Hitler apparently disapproved of the match because he didn't want his daughter marrying a mass murderer, and had him arrested in a trip to Berlin by the Gestapo and sent off to the Eastern Front, which is a handy way to get rid of a brother-in-law you don't want in the time of war. So Asperger publicly called for the transfer of children to Spiegelgrund. So this is a talk he gave that was republished in the Munich Medical Weekly, a prestigious journal, saying that, quote, "For all difficult cases, only a long and continuous observation is proper, like those carried out in his own clinic or the reformatory Spiegelgrund." And he followed his own advice. Here are two girls who he transferred to Spiegelgrund. 2.5-year-old Hertha Schreiber, she was the youngest of 9 children, was severely disabled by meningitis and diphtheria. Asperger concluded that, quote, "her accommodation in Spiegelgrund is absolutely necessary." Hertha's mother reportedly told the presiding doctor at Spiegelgrund, if the child could not be helped, perhaps it would be better if she should die, as she would have nothing in this world anyway. Herta did die 2 months after Asperger's transfer, and one wonders if the mother's wishes played a role in Asperger's thinking, because there are numerous cases where if the mother's overburdened at home and has a disabled child and is unable to cope, he would follow the wishes and institutionalize the child. So 5-year-old Elizabeth, he transferred to Spiegelgrund. She could speak only a single word, mama. The nurse at Spiegelgrund wrote, she has, quote, a friendly nature, is very affectionate and flattering with caregivers. If she is treated strictly, she will cry and hug the nurse. She was killed 4 months after she was admitted to Spiegelgrund, and her brain harvested, kept with a collection of over 400 children's brains in the cellar of Spiegelgrund. So this is also context. Meanwhile, Asperger is working on autism. Okay, so remember, in 1937, he wrote, it's impossible to establish a diagnosis. Then a year later, 1938, he comes out with his own diagnosis, and it uses neutral language. It says this is a confinement of the self, a narrowing of relations. That's kind of neutral language, although he does call them psychopaths. So as time passes, he begins to assume more fascist language. So in 1940, he defines a group of abnormal children, who we refer to as autistic psychopaths. These loner children fall out of every community. They live their own lives without an emotional relationship to the environment. They also react abnormally to the needs of the environment. So basically, his language has become more normative, right? These are abnormal children. They're behaving abnormal. And he's more concerned with social connectedness, right? He calls them loners. They don't have an emotional attachment. So he's shifted a bit. Then in 1944, this is his seminal treatise that is cited today on autism, and this is his postdoctoral thesis that he wrote for promotion. At this time, the Children's Hospital was really desperate to promote people because, remember, the purge of liberal and Jewish faculty, so he was sort of put up through the ranks, even though his thesis was really a rush job, and if you read it now, it's remarkable that it passed for science. But he wrote, the autist is only himself and not an active member of the greater organism which he is influenced by and which he influences constantly. Okay, so here we have members and greater organisms, and I mean, this is fully fascist language, right? And he becomes more and more concerned with aptitude for community here. And then later in the thesis, he adopts Nazi psychiatry's central tenet of Gemüt. He'd never written about Gemüt before, but now he's up for promotion. There's Gemüt. Here we are. And so my argument is that basically autism was conceived as the psychological opposite of Nazism, right? That it's children who lack the capacity for fascism. And Asperger, who was fluent in both Greek and Latin, might have had this in mind, as fascio is the bundle or the group, and autos is the self turned inward. So Asperger did prize, one of the reasons he has this reputation today as valuing children with disabilities is because he said some were superhuman. Right? And we kind of have this idea of, Asperger's today as people can possess these savant powers and are really remarkable. And Asperger did prize these special abilities in math and other technical subjects and said they were at the, quote, favorable end of an autistic range. He held a highly gendered view of this in declaring that the autistic personality is an extreme variant of male intelligence, of the male character. And this is echoing the gender stereotypes of the day, saying that boys had a gift for logical thinking, for abstraction, whereas girls were more for the concrete and practical. And he said in over 200 cases of autism, he had never seen a case in girls, ever. This was a male characteristic. He did say after the war, while there were no female cases in Austria, in the United States there were some because girls had become more masculinized in the United States. Yeah. So Asperger believed that many of the boys could be remediated if they received intensive help and therapy. These were boys that were worth reclaiming for the national community, and he was far more dismissive of girls who showed the same traits, and they were sent to correctional facilities. So I went through some of the case files of these children, of boys and girls who were described in the same terms and met opposite fates. So Fritz, for example, fell out of the community. It was impossible to get him to play in a group. His eye gaze went mostly into space. Haro would never play with others. These were sort of clinic notes written on these boys. But in his treatise, and we know this from his case files, he treated these boys with genuine care and kindness and employed a lot of therapies we use today. This is also why Asperger is considered very progressive. His clinic engaged in play therapies and drama and music. He believed in giving children special aids at school and special tutoring and, one-on-one kind of what we consider play therapy for boys who were deemed to have potential. So here are some files of girls that I found. Christine Burka was, quote, difficult to influence from the outside. She was closed, inhibited, hard to reach. You can see her clinic note there, kein Gemüt, no Gemüt. And then you can see his official diagnosis of Christine is not a psychiatric diagnosis, but it's a character variant. This is his handwriting. He was born left-handed, but then was forced to be right-handed, so it's terrible, the poor historian. She was egocentric, vulgar, oppositional, and underhanded, and she was sent to a correctional institution. She did not receive the kind of care the boys did. Elfrida and Margarita faced even worse fates. Again, describing them in the same language as the boys he called autistic. He said that Margarita did not participate at all in the community of children. Her facial expression was remarkably empty. She would stare impassively before her. Again, I could just read all these quotes, same characteristics given to Elfrida. So here's what happened to them. Jekelius, remember Paula Hitler's fiance, visited Asperger's clinic, and she was transferred the same day. Margarita was introduced to Jekelius. Elfrida was sent to Abteilung Dr. Illing. That's the killing pavilion in Spiegelgrund. So those are the fates that Elfrida and Margarita faced, even though they manifested. I mean, we can't say that these girls looked like the boys, right? But they are marking similar symptoms, and they're having opposite fates. So Asperger not only had a gendered view of autism, he had an extremely eugenicist view in general. Again, some people point to his effusive language about the highly original genius of children on the most favorable end of the autistic range, and they speculate that he used the autism diagnosis as a way of protecting children from the killing, saying they're so great. He was using the autism diagnosis like a psychiatric Schindler's List, right? But this benevolent rhetoric was in keeping with Nazi psychiatry. All these guys were writing really great things about children. This was their rhetoric, the children that they believed could be brought into the folk. It was the children that they believed were irredeemable that they exterminated. There was a real bifurcated idea of disability in Nazi Germany. It wasn't just that you were disabled, you could be remediated or you were worthless. There was a solid line there. So this is Asperger's language, who were on the unfavorable end of his rage, would grow up to roam the streets as originals, grotesque, and dilapidated. Okay, so how did we get to where we are today? Just briefly, and then this will be part of the extended conversation. What I think is most telling is Asperger never really wrote about autism again after the war. He didn't disavow it. He just never conducted any more research on it. And he wrote a handful of very short papers for newsletters. But that's really about it. He was more interested in religious themes and social commentary. And So to my mind, this really makes me question the extent to which he believed in the autism diagnosis to begin with, or was this a strategic careerist move during the Nazi period where he followed his senior colleagues for a